Tu Diep greets my dear friends. The storm passes. The flood sweeps away everything. Only what remains is there. Today we will come to the next episode of that story. Since that morning, clouds had been rolling down the mountain in thick, curling waves like dense smoke flooding the slopes. The people of Dongmok village, a small, remote settlement nestled at the foot of the northern Rocky Mountain range, had lived through countless seasons of rain and wind. But never had the sky felt so heavy and foreboding as that day. The crank-powered loudspeakers blared urgent announcements: emergency warning, storm at level 14, expected to rise to level 15 upon reaching land. All mountain residents must evacuate before 2 p.m. The repeated calls felt like a desperate push of fate. Tu Diep stood by the window of her makeshift house, eyes fixed on the darkening sky. That tiny wooden shelter, barely 10 square meters, had been her home alone for nearly 3 years. It was rebuilt from scraps of wood left after a flash flood, thin planks for walls, an old corrugated iron roof barely holding together, no stronger than a tent. But it was where she painted, read, cared for a small injured dog named Mitt, and kept the last memories of her parents. She knew staying was a risk. She knew the storm would tear her fragile home apart. But Mitt was hurt and couldn't travel far. She tried to carry him during the evacuation. But midway, he convulsed from the cold and passed out. No one could wait. The villagers were busy saving family and children. They urged her to leave the dog behind. She couldn't. She turned back just as rain began to lash across her cheeks. At 1:45 p.m. she barred the door, nailed boards over the windows, sat down holding Mitt wrapped in the only dry wool scarf left. Rain hammered the iron roof, wind howled through the cracks. The house shook like a sinking boat. Thunder cracked deafeningly. The wind ripped at the walls. Dry crack sounds echoed as a plank was torn off. No electricity. No phone signal, only her and Mitt trapped in the screaming storm. Outside, huge boulders began to tumble down the mountainside. She could hear and feel the earth tremble beneath her. At that moment, James Tran was speeding his four-wheel drive through the stormy mountain pass. From the city, he had learned Dongmok was completely cut off, roads collapsed, communication lost. Most villages evacuated, but some remained trapped. Her name wasn't on any list. His heart froze. Tu Diep, the woman he once met only briefly to negotiate a project, had become unforgettable to him because her eyes held the entire mountain's quiet strength, resilience, and loneliness. He couldn't leave her alone in the storm. Defying all objections, he left the city by rescue helicopter, then drove through the blocked roads with a special vehicle. The wind tried to rip his car from the ground. When it became impassable, he went on foot, wading through mud and fallen rocks, his flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. But he remembered the path to the village clearly. He remembered the porch of her house where she once brewed tea, gazing at the mountains. He had wanted to ask her for a painting then, but never dared. Now he just wanted her alive. At the village entrance, the scene looked ravaged by an invisible force. Trees fell blocking the way. Roofs scattered like debris. Water waist high. He shouted her name. No answer. He searched house by house, shining his light inside. At the last wooden house near the mountain cliff, he spotted the faint glow of a dying oil lamp. One wall had been blown away by the wind. The house leaned to one side. He kicked the door open, called loudly, "Tu Diep." She lay curled in a corner, clutching mitt, eyes half closed, pale lips. Hearing his voice, she blinked, tears mixing with rain. James. How did you get here? He couldn't speak. His throat tight. He knelt, lifted her into his arms, draped his jacket over her shoulders, tucked mitt inside his shirt. He looked around. The roof was cracked. The wind began to pierce through the holes like hundreds of cold knives. He carried her out. The wind nearly threw him down. But he braced himself, stepping carefully through waist-deep water. Rocks crashed nearby. Mitt whimpered softly. Tu Diep grabbed his collar. "Don't turn back, James. You could die." He gritted his teeth against the wind. "And you think I could live if I left you behind?" When they reached higher ground, a rescue helicopter's spotlight found them. James nearly collapsed as he placed her on the stretcher. He stayed by her side all night. The field hospital, holding her cold hand, overwhelmed by feelings he'd never known, regret, pain, and a fierce love born in the storm. Tu Diep woke at dawn. The sky was clear. After the terrifying night, the mountains and forest seemed exhausted and silent. She opened her eyes to see James asleep beside her, still holding her hand. She gently touched his cheek. He woke. "You're okay," she said. He smiled, the first smile in many lonely years. They didn't need many words. Mitt stirred weakly in his basket, legs still trembling but eyes bright again. She sat up and took his hand. "You're so stubborn, James," he said only. "I'd rather risk my life to reach you than survive and live with regret." After the storm, Dong Mok was devastated. Roofs collapsed, trees uprooted, roads buried in mud. But amid the destruction, the villagers' spirit did not break. Tu Diep and James joined the community in rebuilding. They organized aid from outside, cleared debris, rebuilt homes, restored the main road to reconnect with the world. Tu Diep opened free art classes for village children, bringing life and hope to young souls battered by the storm. James was no longer the distant CEO, he became a steadfast companion, frequently arriving with rice, vegetables, or sometimes a new painting she made. The love between James and Tu Diep was no longer just their own story but a symbol of strength and faith within. In the community, they proved that in the darkest moments, love is the most enduring force, capable of overcoming any challenge, protecting what is most precious in life. When everything seemed to collapse under the storm's fury, it was love that held them upright, built their future, and lit the way for hope. Yet, just as life in Dong Mok began to return to normal, a mysterious letter arrived for James, an old friend from his past. now entangled in a dangerous secret, reaching out for help. The calm after the storm was only the beginning. What new challenges awaited James and Tu Diep? Would their love withstand the storms yet to come? What awaits James and Tu Diep ahead? Do you feel like something is about to happen? Thank you for following my story. Lytudiep.